Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
When I found out my dad and stepmom sold my childhood home, I was devastated. That house wasn't just four walls. It was where my memories lived, where I felt closest to my late mom. But when I tried to voice how I felt, they dismissed me, saying I was too attached to the past. What they didn't realize was that this betrayal was just the beginning of a much deeper rift. The call came on a quiet Saturday morning. I was halfway through my coffee, planning to spend the day catching up on work when my phone buzzed. Seeing my dad's name on the screen, I smiled. It wasn't unusual for him to call out of the blue, usually to talk about the weather or the latest thing Karen had convinced him to buy. "Hey," he said, his tone overly cheerful. "Just wanted to let you know we've decided to sell the house." I froze, my coffee mug hovering midair. "What house?" I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling I knew the answer. "Your mom's house," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "The one you grew up in, Karen, and I think it's time to move on, you know? Start fresh." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My childhood home, the place where I'd taken my first steps, celebrated birthdays, and spent countless lazy Sundays baking cookies with my mom. Even after she passed, the house had remained a sanctuary, a place where her presence felt alive, tucked into every corner and every memory. I gripped the phone tighter, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Dad, you can't just sell it. That house means so much to me." There was a long pause before he sighed, the way he always did when he thought I was being unreasonable. "I knew you'd be upset," he said finally, "but it's not practical for us to keep it. Karen and I need the money for our new place, and besides, you don't even live there anymore." "That doesn't mean it doesn't matter," I snapped, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "It's not just a house, Dad. It's part of Mom." His tone shifted, growing impatient. "You're too attached to the past," he said dismissively. "You have to let go sometime. Things change, and it's time we moved on." I wanted to argue, to make him see how much that house meant, not just to me, but to all of us. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. My dad had always been conflict-averse, and Karen was the type of person who got what she wanted. If she'd set her sights on selling the house, there was no stopping it. After the call ended, I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't care. All I could think about was the house, the creaky wooden floors, the smell of my mom's lavender-scented candles, the spot in the backyard where she used to plant flowers every spring. I couldn't bear the thought of someone else living there, of strangers repainting the walls and tearing out the garden. It felt like losing her all over again. The worst part was the casual way my dad had broken the news, like it was no big deal. "You're too attached to the past," he'd said, as if my feelings were nothing more than an inconvenience. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, replaying the conversation in my head. By the time evening rolled around, my sadness had turned into anger. I needed to do something. Anything. I picked up my phone and called him back. After hanging up with my dad, I couldn't focus on anything else. My mind spun with questions, frustration bubbling under the surface. How could he be so dismissive? How could Karen, who barely knew my mom, have any say in what happened to her house? It felt like a bad dream, one I couldn't wake up from. I spent hours pacing my apartment, replaying the conversation in my head. Maybe there was more to the story. Maybe they were in financial trouble, and this was the only way out. Or maybe my dad hadn't realized how much this decision would hurt me. I clung to those possibilities, hoping there was some explanation that would make this all make sense. The next morning, I decided to call him back. I had barely slept, and my voice was still raw with emotion when he answered. "Dad," I said, skipping the pleasantries, "have you signed anything yet?" "No, not yet," he replied, though his tone carried an edge of caution. "But we've already listed it. The realtor says it'll sell fast." My heart sank. "Dad, wait," I said quickly, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "At least give me a chance to buy it. I can figure something out, alone maybe. Just don't sell it to a stranger." He sighed heavily, the kind of sigh he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "We can't afford to wait, honey," he said, his voice softening just enough to sound patronizing. "We've already found a place we like, and we need the money from the sale to make it happen." I clenched my fist, the frustration mounting. "So, you're selling my childhood home to buy a place with Karen?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's not just for Karen," he replied defensively. "It's for both of us. We're starting a new chapter, and you should be happy for us." "Happy for you?" I repeated, incredulous. "Dad, you're erasing everything that's left of Mom. Do you even care how this makes me feel? Of course I care, he said, but there was a hollow quality to his words, as if he were reciting a line he didn't truly believe. But you have to understand, this is what's best for us. You'll always have the memories, no matter where the house is. I gripped the phone tightly, trying to steady my breathing. Memories aren't enough, I said, my voice breaking. That house is the only place where I still feel connected to her. And you're just throwing it away like it's nothing. It's not nothing, he said, sounding annoyed now. But we can't live in the past forever. Karen and I need to move forward, and we can't do that if we're tied down by the past. The words hit me like a slap. Tied down by the past? Was that all my mom's memory meant to him now? Something to be moved on from? After the call, I sat in stunned silence, staring at my phone as if it might somehow offer an answer. The betrayal stung more deeply than I expected. I knew my dad wasn't the most emotionally attuned person, but I never thought he could be so dismissive of something that meant so much to me. And Karen, I could practically hear her in the background, whispering her opinions, steering him toward her version of what's best. She barely knew my mom, and yet she was now calling the shots on something so personal, so sacred. It wasn't just about the house. It was about everything it represented. My childhood, my family before Karen entered the picture, my mom's memory. Losing it felt like losing her all over again, and the thought of strangers living there, repainting the walls, and tearing out the garden she had lovingly tended made my chest ache. I knew I had to do something, but what? My dad had already made up his mind, and Karen clearly wasn't going to let me sway him. As much as I wanted to fight, I felt powerless, like I was watching my history slip through my fingers. This wasn't just a house, it was a betrayal. And for the first time, I realized my dad and I might never see eye to eye again. The text came in the middle of my workday, a short and cheery message from Karen. House is sold. Hope you're doing well. I stared at my phone, my stomach churning. That was it? That's how they were going to tell me the house I grew up in, the home that held every important memory of my childhood, was officially gone? No phone call from my dad, no warning, no chance to say goodbye. Just a casual text from Karen, as if she were announcing that they'd bought a new couch. I couldn't focus on anything after that. My work emails blurred together, and every time I glanced at my phone, the message felt like it was mocking me. Finally, I grabbed my keys and headed to the house. I wasn't sure what I planned to do. Maybe I just needed to see it one last time, to say goodbye in my own way. When I pulled into the driveway, the first thing I saw was the sold sign staked in the front yard. My chest tightened, and I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Seeing the sign made it real in a way that the text hadn't. I sat there for a long time, staring at the house. The shutters were the same dark green my mom had painted them years ago, and the porch swing still hung in its usual spot. I could almost see her sitting there, sipping her coffee and waving at neighbors as they walked by. But the house didn't feel the same anymore. It felt hollow. The windows were dark, the lawn unkempt, and the flower beds that my mom used to fill with colorful blooms were overrun with weeds. It was as if the house had already started to forget us. I got out of the car and walked up the front steps, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I knew it was probably locked, but I turned it anyway, half hoping my dad might still be inside packing. When the door didn't budge, I peered through the living room window. The sight inside made my heart ache. The furniture was gone, replaced by stacks of cardboard boxes. The walls, once covered in family photos, were bare, and the shelves my mom had lovingly decorated with knickknacks and books were empty. It was like the soul of the house had been stripped away, leaving nothing but an empty shell. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, letting the memories wash over me. I saw myself as a little girl, playing with dolls in the living room while my mom baked cookies in the kitchen. I saw birthday parties, movie nights, and quiet mornings spent reading on the couch. I also saw my mom in every corner of the house. The way she used to hum while cleaning, the way she'd laugh while trying to fix something she had no idea how to fix, and the way she made everything feel warm and safe. Tears blurred my vision, but I refused to let them fall. This wasn't just about losing the house. It was about losing her all over again. My dad and Karen didn't understand that. They couldn't. To them, it was just a piece of property, a transaction to fund their next adventure. When I finally got back in my car, I couldn't bring myself to leave right away. Instead, I sat there, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the sold sign. It felt like a final, cruel reminder that the life I'd known was gone, replaced by something cold and unrecognizable. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the house. I wondered who would live there now, if they would paint over the walls or tear out the garden. I hated the thought of strangers walking through those rooms, oblivious to the history and love they'd held. I texted my dad, unable to keep my frustration bottled up any longer. "Why didn't you tell me the house sold?" Karen's text was the first I heard about it. His response came quickly, but it was as dismissive as I'd feared. "Didn't think it mattered. You already knew it was going to happen." I stared at his message, anger bubbling in my chest. It did matter. It mattered more than anything. But no matter how much I tried to explain that to him, I knew he wouldn't understand. He and Karen had moved on, and they expected me to do the same. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something painful. The house wasn't just a casualty of Karen's influence. It was a symbol of how much my dad had changed, of how little he seemed to care about the things that mattered to me. And that hurt far more than losing the house ever could. I couldn't hold it in any longer. The anger, the hurt, the overwhelming sense of betrayal. It all boiled over when I finally saw my dad in person. We met at his new house, the one he and Karen had been so eager to move into. The place was sleek and modern, with none of the warmth or personality of the home I'd grown up in. It already felt like Karen's house, not my dad's. The moment I stepped through the door, I knew I wasn't going to be able to keep my emotions in check. I didn't even wait for pleasantries. "How could you do this to me?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger. "You sold the house without even giving me a real chance to save it." My dad looked startled, as if he hadn't expected me to bring it up so directly. "I told you we needed to move quickly," he said, his tone defensive. "It wasn't personal." "It wasn't personal?" I repeated, my voice rising. "That house wasn't just some building, Dad. It was my home. It was the last piece of Mom I had left." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I understand how you feel," he began, but I cut him off. "No, you don't," I snapped. "If you did, you never would have sold it, at least not without giving me a chance to buy it myself. You didn't even give me time to try." Karen, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, scrolling through her phone, finally spoke up. "You're overreacting," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "It's just a house. You need to stop clinging to the past and move on." I turned to her, my blood boiling. "It's not just a house," I said through gritted teeth. "It's where my mom lived, where she raised me, where every important memory of my childhood happened. You don't get to tell me how to feel about that." Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. "Everyone has to move on at some point," she said. "Your dad and I are building a future together, and keeping that old house wasn't part of the plan. You're being emotional about something that doesn't matter anymore." Her words felt like a slap, but it was my dad's silence that hurt the most. He just stood there avoiding my gaze, letting Karen speak for him. "Do you even care how this has affected me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Do you care that you sold the house without even thinking about what it meant to me? Or am I just supposed to be okay with being pushed aside for your new life with Karen?" "Of course I care," he said, but his voice was hollow, lacking conviction. "But you have to understand, we couldn't keep the house forever. It wasn't practical. Karen's right. We need to move forward." I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man in front of me with the dad I used to know. The dad who had once gone out of his way to make me feel loved and supported, who had always been there for me after my mom died. That man seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone who cared more about keeping Karen happy than about his own daughter's feelings. "You've already moved forward," I said bitterly. "You've moved so far forward that you've left me behind." The conversation ended with me storming out, unable to stay in that house any longer. As I drove home, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The anger was almost too much to bear, but beneath it all was a deep, aching sadness. I realized that I wasn't just mourning the loss of the house. I was mourning the loss of the relationship I used to have with my dad. Selling the house was just the latest in a series of choices that had made it clear where his priorities lay. For the first time, I started to wonder if our relationship could ever truly recover. After that explosive confrontation, things between my dad and me were never the same. Every phone call, every visit felt awkward and stilted, as if there was an invisible wall between us that neither of us knew how to break down. I stopped bringing up the house. I couldn't bear to hear him or Karen justify the sale again. But the unspoken tension lingered like a dark cloud over every interaction. Karen, of course, didn't help. She seemed to take every opportunity to remind me that selling the house had been for the best. During one visit, she casually mentioned how liberating it was to get rid of old baggage. "It's amazing how much lighter you feel when you let go of the past," she said, smiling smugly over her glass of wine. I bit my tongue, knowing that any response would just lead to another argument. But her words stayed with me, fueling the resentment I felt toward both of them. To Karen, the house had been nothing more than an obstacle to her fresh start with my dad. She couldn't or wouldn't understand what it had meant to me. I started visiting less and less, unable to handle the tension. When I did visit, I felt like a stranger in my dad's new home. It didn't feel like a family space. It felt like Karen's house. The furniture was all hers, sleek and modern, with none of the warmth or charm that had defined our old home. The walls were covered in her tastefully curated artwork, and the shelves were lined with knickknacks she'd collected from her travels. Every corner of the house screamed Karen, and there was no trace of my mom or the life we'd had before she came into the picture. Even the dining table felt foreign, with its polished wood and matching chairs that looked more like they belonged in a showroom than a home. Sitting at that table during one particularly awkward dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong there. My dad tried to act like everything was fine, chatting about his garden and Karen's latest decorating project. "You're always welcome here," he said at one point, forcing a smile. But it didn't feel true. The warmth that had once defined our relationship was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of resentment neither of us could address. I nodded politely, pretending to agree, but inside, I felt a pang of sadness. This wasn't home. This wasn't family. The distance between us grew wider with each passing month. My dad noticed, of course, and he tried to reach out in his own way. He'd call every so often, asking how work was going or if I needed anything, but the conversations were always surface level, devoid of the closeness we'd once shared. One afternoon, he left me a voicemail that stopped me in my tracks. "I miss you," he said simply, his voice tinged with regret. "I know things haven't been easy lately, but I want you to know you'll always be my daughter. I hope we can figure this out." Hearing those words made my heart ache. I wanted to believe them, to think that we could somehow repair the damage that had been done. But the reality was more complicated. As much as I miss my dad, I couldn't ignore the way he'd dismissed my feelings, the way he'd prioritized Karen's happiness over mine. The rift between us wasn't just about the house. It was about everything the house represented. It was about my mom's memory, the life we'd shared before Karen came along, and the unspoken expectation that I should simply accept the changes without complaint. I wanted to fix things, but I didn't know how. Every time I thought about reaching out, the anger and hurt came rushing back, making it impossible to take the first step. And so, the wall between us remained, unspoken but ever-present, a constant reminder of everything we'd lost. The more time passed, the more I began to notice a pattern in my dad's behavior. Every decision he made seemed to have Karen's fingerprints all over it. It wasn't just the house. Her influence extended to every aspect of his life. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but subtle comments from family friends started to confirm my suspicions. "Your dad seems different these days," one friend said during a casual conversation. "Karen's got him wrapped around her finger. He doesn't make a decision without her approval." Another friend, who had known my parents for decades, pulled me aside at a gathering and said quietly, "It's like he's not himself anymore. I've never seen him so passive." The words stung because they rang true. My dad had always been easygoing, but since marrying Karen, it was as if he'd lost the ability, or the desire, to stand up for himself. And while I knew he hated conflict, the extent of her control over him was far greater than I'd realized. It all started to make sense in hindsight. Karen had always been assertive, the type of person who knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to bulldoze her way to get it. My dad, on the other hand, was a peacekeeper, someone who would rather go along with things than risk rocking the boat. I remembered little moments from their early relationship that I'd brushed off at the time. The way Karen would casually dismiss his opinions during conversations, or the way she'd steer him toward decisions that always seemed to benefit her more than him. But hearing it confirmed by others added a new layer to my frustration. It wasn't just about losing the house anymore. It was about realizing how much control Karen had over my dad's life, and by extension mine. The final straw came when I found out where the money from the house had gone. It happened during another strained visit to their new home. Karen was showing off their recent purchases, a fancy dining table, an expensive sound system, and, as she proudly announced, plans for a vacation property. "Wait, what?" I asked, my eyes narrowing. "Oh, didn't your dad tell you?" Karen said, her tone light and dismissive. "We're buying a cabin up in the mountains. It's something I've always dreamed of, and we figured, why not?" The money from the house sale made it possible. I turned to my dad, my stomach sinking. "Is this true?" He looked uncomfortable, avoiding my gaze. "It's an investment," he said quietly. "It's a good opportunity, and we've been wanting a place to get away to. My anger flared. So, you sold the house, our house, to buy a vacation property for Karen? It's not just for Karen, he said defensively. It's for both of us, and it's a smart financial move. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The house that had been my home, the place where my mom's memories still lived, had been reduced to a down payment on Karen's dream getaway. I didn't hold back. Do you even hear yourself right now? I demanded. You sold the house where we built our family, so you could buy a cabin in the mountains? How does that even make sense? Karen never wanted to back down, jumped in. You're being dramatic again, she said, rolling her eyes. The house was just sitting there, draining money. The cabin is an investment. You should be happy your dad and I are building something new. It wasn't just sitting there, I shot back. It was our home. It was where Mom lived, where I grew up. And you turned it into a vacation property like it was nothing. My dad finally spoke up, his voice firm but strained. Enough, he said, his eyes pleading. I know this is hard for you, but it's done. We can't change the past. Can't you just try to be happy for us? I stared at him, my chest tight with emotion. He looked tired, defeated, like a man caught between two worlds. But his words only deepened the hurt. No, I said quietly, my voice trembling. I can't be happy for you when every decision you make feels like another way to erase Mom and everything she built. The room fell into an awkward silence, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my bag and left, my head spinning with anger and disbelief. That night, as I replayed the conversation in my mind, I realized something painful. My dad didn't just let Karen influence him. He actively chose her vision of the future over ours. The cabin, the new house, the life they were building together. It all came at the expense of the family we'd been before. And while I wanted to believe he was still the same dad who had once put me first, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Karen wasn't just steering the ship. She'd taken full control. And my dad had willingly handed her the wheel. The family gathering was supposed to be a cheerful occasion. A barbecue at my dad and Karen's new house to celebrate the start of summer. Relatives and friends milled around the backyard, chatting and laughing as if nothing had changed. But for me, the cheerful atmosphere only highlighted how out of place I felt. I wandered through the house, trying to avoid small talk. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of Karen's influence. Sleek, modern furniture, abstract art on the walls, and the faint smell of some overpriced candles she'd probably ordered online. There was no trace of my mom, no sign that this had ever been a part of the family I grew up in. The final straw came when I overheard Karen talking to a group of relatives. The cabin is coming along so beautifully, she gushed. It's going to be our little sanctuary. I can't wait to have everyone up there for a weekend getaway. I froze, her words hitting me like a punch to the gut. The cabin, the thing they'd bought with money from the house sale, was now a source of pride, something she flaunted without a second thought. I couldn't stay silent any longer. I walked over, my heart pounding. Karen, I said, my voice steady but laced with anger. Did you even care about what that house meant to me? The conversation around us came to a halt, and all eyes turned to us. Karen looked up, startled for a moment, before regaining her composure. What are you talking about? She asked, her tone sharp and defensive. The house, I repeated, my voice trembling. My childhood home, the place where I grew up, where my mom's memories still lived. Did you even care what selling it would do to me? Karen rolled her eyes, her dismissive attitude on full display. You're too attached to the past, she said. It's unhealthy. People need to move on. Your dad and I are building a future together, and that house didn't fit into it. Her words ignited something inside me. Move on? I snapped. Do you have any idea how condescending you sound? That house wasn't just a building. It was a part of my mom, a part of our family. And you tore it away without a second thought. Karen crossed her arms, clearly unfazed by my outburst. It's just a house, she said flatly. Your memories don't depend on it. You're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. I turned to my dad, desperate for him to say something, anything to back me up. But he just stood there, looking uncomfortable, his eyes darting between me and Karen. Dad, I said, my voice breaking. Do you really think this is okay? Do you think it's fine to dismiss everything that house meant to me, to us, just because Karen wanted something new? He finally spoke, but his words crushed me. I didn't want to hurt you, he said quietly. But Karen's right. We needed to move forward. I wish you could see that. I stared at him, stunned. This was the man who had once told me family came first, who had promised to keep my mom's memory alive. Now he was standing there, letting Karen call the shots, letting her rewrite our history as if it didn't matter. You've already moved forward, I said bitterly. So far forward that you've left me behind. The weight of the room was unbearable, and I knew I couldn't stay there. I turned and walked out, ignoring the awkward silence that followed. That night, as I sat in my car in the driveway of my apartment, I felt an overwhelming sense of finality. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about everything it represented: the loss of my mom, the loss of my family as I'd known it, and the realization that my dad had chosen a path that didn't include me. There was no reasoning with Karen, no convincing her to understand what the house had meant to me. And my dad? He wasn't the man I thought he was. He wasn't the father I'd relied on for so many years. For the first time, I let myself truly mourn, not just for the house, but for the relationship I'd lost with my dad. It felt like a piece of me had been ripped away, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever get it back. After that disastrous family gathering, I knew something had to change. Every interaction with my dad and Karen felt like a fresh wound, a reminder of everything I'd lost. The house was gone. My relationship with my dad was fractured, and Karen's dismissive attitude was a constant source of frustration. So I made a difficult decision. I stepped back. At first, it felt unnatural, almost wrong, to pull away from the man who had raised me. But every conversation with him left me feeling worse, not better. I couldn't keep pretending that things were okay when they so clearly weren't. I stopped answering their calls as often, letting texts go unanswered for days. When Karen sent me cheerful updates about the cabin or their latest purchases, I deleted them without replying. I skipped family dinners, coming up with vague excuses about work or prior commitments. At first, my dad didn't seem to notice. He continued sending me casual messages, as if everything was fine. But as weeks turned into months, the distance became more apparent. One evening, he called me directly, his voice tinged with concern. "I feel like I haven't heard from you in ages," he said. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. Part of me wanted to spill everything, to tell him exactly how much his decisions had hurt me. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. He'd made his choices, and Karen's influence wasn't going anywhere. "I've just been busy," I said instead, keeping my tone light. "Work's been hectic." "Well, don't be a stranger," he replied, his voice hesitant. "You know you're always welcome here." I muttered a polite response, but the words felt hollow. I wasn't sure if I believed them anymore. Around this time, I started going to therapy. At first, I was skeptical. What could a stranger possibly say that would make me feel better? But my therapist, a kind and patient woman named Amelia, helped me see things in a way I hadn't before. "You're carrying a lot of anger," she said during one session, her voice calm and measured. "And that anger is valid. But holding on to it is only hurting you. Letting go doesn't mean you're condoning what happened. It just means you're choosing to free yourself from its weight." Her words hit me hard. For so long, I'd been clinging to the anger, using it as a shield against the pain of loss. But Amelia was right. It wasn't helping me heal. It was just keeping me stuck in the same cycle of frustration and sadness. Over time, I learned to let go of the anger, piece by piece. It wasn't easy, and there were days when it felt impossible. But with Amelia's guidance, I began channeling my energy into building something new for myself. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and challenges that gave me a sense of purpose. I reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during the turmoil, leaning on them for support and finding joy in their company. I also started exploring hobbies I'd abandoned years ago. I took up painting again, pouring my emotions onto the canvas in a way that felt cathartic and freeing. I signed up for a cooking class, learning to recreate the recipes my mom used to make, savoring the bittersweet nostalgia it brought. Slowly but surely, I began to move forward. The loss of the house still lingered, and my relationship with my dad remained strained, but I was no longer consumed by it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own happiness. Stepping back from my dad wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The space gave me room to breathe, to heal, and to figure out who I was outside of the tangled web of family conflict. As the months turned into a year, I realized that while the pain of what had happened might never fully go away, it no longer defined me. I was building a new life, one that felt full and meaningful, even without the pieces I'd lost. As the months passed, the raw pain of losing the house began to fade, replaced by a quieter, deeper understanding of what it had represented. At first, I thought the sale of the house was just about the house itself, a place, a building, a piece of my history. But over time, I realized it was much more than that. The house had been the last tangible connection to my mom, to the family we had been before Karen came into the picture. Its sale wasn't just about losing a physical space. It was about losing a sense of stability and identity. The memories that house held were a part of who I was, and watching it be erased felt like watching a piece of myself disappear. But as I reflected on everything that had happened, I came to an unexpected realization. The problem wasn't that I was holding on to the past. It was that I had let other people decide what parts of the past were worth keeping. In therapy, Amelia helped me unpack these feelings, guiding me to see the difference between cherishing memories and being weighed down by them. It's okay to honor the past, she said during one session, but it's also important to protect it in ways that feel meaningful to you. No one else gets to decide what's sacred to you. Her words stayed with me, echoing in my mind as I went about my days. I began to realize how much power I had ceded to my dad and Karen, how much I had allowed their choices to dictate my sense of worth and belonging. The sale of the house had been the catalyst for these realizations, a painful but necessary turning point. It forced me to confront not just the dynamics in my family, but also my own role in them. I had spent so much time trying to hold on to a version of my family that no longer existed, hoping that if I tried hard enough, I could make things go back to the way they were. But I couldn't, and that was okay. Once I accepted that, I began to find new ways to honor my mom and the life we'd shared in that house. I started small, framing old photos, planting some of her favorite flowers in my backyard, and cooking her recipes on special occasions. These little rituals brought me a surprising sense of peace. They reminded me that while the house was gone, the memories weren't. I didn't need 4 walls and a roof to keep my mom's spirit alive. It was already a part of me, woven into the fabric of who I was. I also started to reevaluate my definition of family. For so long, I had clung to the idea that family was about blood ties and shared history. But the events of the past year had shown me that family wasn't just about who you were born to. It was about who showed up for you, who respected you, and who made you feel seen. Some of those people were still part of my family, like the aunt who called to check on me after the house was sold, or the cousin who invited me over for dinner when I needed a break from the tension at home. But others were friends, co-workers, and even acquaintances who had offered support and kindness when I least expected it. Reflecting on all of this helped me let go of some of the anger I'd been carrying toward my dad. It didn't erase the hurt, but it gave me a sense of clarity. He had made his choice, and while it wasn't the choice I wanted him to make, I couldn't let it define my relationship with him, or with myself. I still kept my distance, but it wasn't out of spite. It was a way to protect my peace, to give myself the space I needed to heal. And in that space, I found something I hadn't expected: gratitude. Gratitude for the years I'd had in that house, for the memories it held, and for the lessons I'd learned along the way. Gratitude for the people who had supported me, and for the strength I'd discovered within myself. The sale of the house had been a turning point, not just in my relationship with my dad, but in how I viewed family, loss, and resilience. And while it wasn't a chapter one would have chosen, it was one that helped me grow in ways I never could have imagined. It's been a few years since everything happened, and though the wounds aren't entirely gone, they've mostly healed. Time has a way of dulling the sharp edges of pain, turning them into something softer, more manageable. The loss of the house, the strained relationship with my dad, even the frustration with Karen, they're all still there, but they don't define me the way they once did. My dad and I have settled into a surface-level relationship. We exchange polite texts and the occasional phone call, mostly about mundane things like work updates or weather. When we see each other at family events, we talk about neutral topics, carefully avoiding anything that might stir up old tensions. It's not the close, loving relationship we once had, but it's functional. And, surprisingly, I'm okay with that. I've stopped expecting more from him, stopped hoping for an apology that will never come, or for him to wake up one day and see things from my perspective. Letting go of those expectations was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was also the most freeing. In the years since I stepped back, I've built a life that feels meaningful and fulfilling in ways I never imagined. My career has taken off, giving me a sense of purpose and accomplishment that I hadn't realized I needed. I've surrounded myself with people who genuinely care about me, friends who celebrate my successes, support me through challenges, and remind me what unconditional love looks like. I've also found ways to carry my mom's memory with me. Her favorite flowers now bloom in my garden, a bright, colorful reminder of her love for life. Her recipes have become a staple in my kitchen, filling my home with a comforting sense of my childhood. And on quiet evenings, I sometimes sit with an old photo album, flipping through pictures and letting myself feel the joy and sadness that come with remembering. Through these small rituals, I've realized something important. My mom's legacy isn't tied to a house or a place. It's in the values she instilled in me, the love she gave me, and the memories we shared. Losing the house was painful, but it didn't erase her presence in my life. Karen and I remain distant, which is fine by me. She has her life with my dad, and I have mine. While I still bristle at the thought of how much influence she holds over him, I've stopped letting it consume me. It's not my battle to fight anymore. As for my dad, I've accepted that our relationship will never go back to what it was. There's a part of me that will always miss the closeness we once had, the way he used to make me feel safe and loved. But I've come to terms with the fact that people change, and sometimes those changes take them in a direction you can't follow. I no longer hold on to the anger or the hurt. Instead, I've channeled those emotions into something positive, a determination to live a life my mom would be proud of. And when I think about her, I know she would be. My life isn't perfect, but it's mine. It's filled with people and experiences that bring me joy, with goals that excite me and memories that comfort me. I've learned to let go of the things I can't control and focus on what I can. Looking back, I see the loss of the house not as an end, but as a beginning, a painful but necessary step in finding my own path. And while it wasn't easy, it taught me a lesson I'll carry with me forever. Sometimes, peace isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about finding the strength to move forward anyway. And that's exactly what I've done.